In the beginning, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat.
No, Odysseus, let him rack his brains with you and the other captives how to fight.
Guilty.
Impossible. Trust me.
No one to weep for me, my friends. No wedding song.
Amo verumque cano, Troiae qui primus laboris Italiam
Dante ha fatto il pieno e per gli altri è rimasto ben poco, which means that Dante filled up.
I was the more deceived.
Confess that you were very bad to hurt my feelings.
Cried Candide, I'm through.
Enough. Who are you then?
Part of that force which would do evil evermore, and yet
She was eating a maraschino ice at that precise moment.
There is no
When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning, he found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous dung beetle.
And hello again. Welcome to Class 2 in our series of Living Literature. Today we are going to talk about what is, by all accounts, the literary masterpiece of the Old Testament, perhaps the literary masterpiece of the Bible, the book of Job. A very difficult read, yes? Very difficult read, yes, it is. It is known for its difficultness. The language is difficult, the metaphors are difficult, and it has probably solicited more commentary than probably any other book in the Bible because of that. It's highly elusive, it's extremely poetic, isn't it? And I mean poetic in the sense that it is allusive and that it is metaphoric, and it does not speak directly in any kind of clear narrative form. Well, the book of Job, the patience of Job, where on earth did that ever come from? It looks like my friend Job from chapter 3 to chapter 41 is anything but patient. Indeed, he's quite heretical, isn't he? What a character. Where's this patience of Job stuff come from? We've all heard the patience of Job. It must be a myth perpetuated by people who have never read it. Huh? What do you think? Yeah.
I think he was very patient to have suffered as long and as much as he did without turning his back on the God he chose to serve.
Yes, yeah, good for you. He really never does turn his back. I think I understand what you mean by that. Yeah, even though he, of course, questions the justice of it, he never denies the existence of the divinity. Yeah.
Well, that's what I was going to say too. Is that he wants justice for God. He wants answers from God, but he never turns his back on God. He doesn't blaspheme at all. He still believes.
Yeah. Let's talk about the form first. Let's get this out of the way right away. You will notice that the patience of Job refers to the prose frame, what is known as the frame. You'll notice that the first two chapters are a very simple prose narrative. There was a man in the land of Uz, and on it goes. And he gets this terrible suffering, blah, 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 and then at the very end, he is rewarded for his faith in God. Someone had the brilliant idea of taking the poetic meditations from chapter 3 to chapter 41 and inserting them into that prose narrative. And that has created great difficulties for scholars because there are certain inconsistencies as a result of these two different forms. You'll remember we talked last time about the orthodox doctrine of rewards and punishments, that one sees that throughout Genesis, for example. Adam and Eve transgressed the divine will, they are punished. Cain slays Abel, he is punished. All sorts of evil on the earth. There is one good man, Noah, he survives. The rest are punished. You all with me on this? We can go on and on with this. It's the orthodox doctrine of rewards and punishments. If you are good, you will be rewarded in this life. If you are bad, you will be punished. What about Job?
Well, Job feels he's been very good and he's been punished, and he just doesn't understand why. And I think his friends don't really understand why Job is having all these things happen either, but they give these reasons of why, and that, he's evil and the good, and just because that's what they've been taught.
Exactly, and they're wrong. Because we know from the prologue don't we? The wonderful dramatic irony in the prologue. Do you know what I mean by dramatic irony? It's that you have a deeper understanding of the situation based on your superior knowledge than the characters in the work. We know why Job is suffering. Job doesn't have a clue. We know why Job is suffering. The friends don't have a clue, right? And we know that he is a good man. I mean, he is so good, it's unbelievable. And yet he suffers. Well, I don't know about you guys, but if this is the way of the world, why be good?
Well, isn't I got the impression when I read Genesis that it's a matter of cause and effect, not, I forget already what the two that you use, but it's more like cause and effect. That Job is in trouble because as an effect of something else that happens. That's
but what has he done? What has he done to deserve his fate? Where is the justice?
He hasn't done anything.
Sure hasn't.
But then there's nothing that was written in the Hebrew scripture or the Greek that would suggest that life is going to be a rose garden. They left that behind at Eden, okay?
Yeah.
To me, it's quite, I don't really find it that complicated, but I think good do suffer. Life has shown that.
Yeah. Life's a bitch and then you die.
But I don't think it's always that way either. I think that it's a matter of cause and effect, and we have to acknowledge that bad things happen to good people for a number of reasons.
Oh, funny you should say that. Use that expression, because we're going to, in a minute, you all remember this book from several years ago? Let me show it to the camera here. When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Yes, by Rabbi Harold Kushner. In a few minutes, we are going to see an interview I did with Harold Kushner on this very subject. The problem of theodicy, a phony word, another one of those academic words. The problem of theodicy. Theodicy. That is, how do you explain an all-powerful, all-good, all-just deity when there is innocent suffering in the world? You can't have it three ways. Something's got to give. And Harold Kushner will talk about that in a little bit. Do you think this is what, I guess I want to start almost, I want to take a big step back and start over here. What is this book about? I don't have a clue. Yeah.
Well, I was going to go back a little bit to the immediate cause of the conversation. It's almost like in the Iliad, among the gods. Here it's God and Satan discussing, oh, look, what this fabulous person, and then Satan is goaded into sending all these plagues, as it were.
Yes. That's exactly right, yeah. And that's almost sinister, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I mean, you're all a little troubled by that? Ooh, it's like, ooh. You know the old quote from, is it from Lear? Yeah, we are but the playthings of the gods. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, here's this little wager going on between God and the Satan, the adversary. Don't think of Satan in the Christian sense of the devil and all of that sort of stuff. He is a member of the heavenly court, and he is the adversary. He's the doubter. He's the one that questions. He's a traditional figure. And essentially what the Satan doubts is Job's motives for being so good, right? He says, well, of course he's good. Who wouldn't be good, you know? If to be good is to be rewarded, well, you'd have to be a chump not to be good, right? And then the book proceeds to turn that whole thing on its head.
But didn't it play that out? Job was good, and not because everything that would protect him was taken away. So he proved that he was good for something beautiful, some other motive other than ulterior motives.
Let me come back to that. Yes, maybe, yeah, but I want to come back to it.
Job is good, but he has, maybe I'm reading it wrong, but he has not had adversity before this time. And if you haven't had tragic adversity, I mean, how do you know? How does anyone know how they're going to handle it? And up until this time, everything has been rolling along for him.
So how does Job handle it?
I think he handles it very well.
He screams at God. How dare you? How dare you? I did nothing. Get down here and answer me. I demand to know what I've done. Where is the charge? I want to hear it. I did nothing wrong. There is no justice. That doesn't sound like the kind of patient, calm, accepting faith. This is a faith that I will maintain mine own integrity before him, he says.
But we're made in God's image, and he too gets angry when he's tested like that. We're made.
Are you talking for God now?
No, we're talking about what we learned before we get to Job in the Bible.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, right.
I mean, this is the foundation that I have before I read Job. I know that if we're made in God's image, we get to have righteous indignation, and that's what Job is displaying here. Not so much impatience as righteous indignation. What's going on here, Dad? I mean, cut it out. I want a breather.
This isn't supposed to happen.
Yeah.
And the three friends come along who are spokespeople for the orthodoxy of the day. They know how God works. It's amazing how theologians always know that, you know? They know how God works. Forget your experience. Your personal experience doesn't matter a whit. I know how God works. If you are being punished, a priori evidence, you have sinned. And Job says, no way. It would have been so easy, wouldn't it, to have fallen down, poured ashes on his head, as he does, scrape himself with pottery shards, and say, forgive me, I have sinned. But he won't do it, because it's dishonest. He will not do it.
This is different than Adam and Eve, who willing or unwilling, took the punishment. They didn't question God, where Job stands firm. I will question what has happened to
He
me.
sure does. He sure does. So what is this book telling me? I should forget organized religion and just be true to my own perception of how things should be.
No.
He said slyly. Help me out here. Yeah, I want to move. I want to be generous.
He's calling upon God to be just, because if God isn't a just God, then his religion is not true, and he's calling God accountable.
He sure is.
God is accountable to man, as man is accountable to God.
Good for you. That is exactly what he's doing.
I
isn't
have
it?
heard that.
Yeah. Oh, okay. But you, I mean, you just hit it, didn't you? Yeah. He is demanding accountability from the deity, and he's rewarded for it. Huh? What kind of craziness is this? You know? What kind of craziness is this? There seems to be some kind of creative spark in heresy.
Well, he says this touch. In no time does he say, because this has happened to me, this means there is nobody there.
That's correct. That is
or because this has happened to me, this means he is not just. He is not listening. He never listens.
Yeah, good for you. You guys have repeatedly come back to this point that he does not throw his hands up and say, the universe is chaotic. He doesn't do that. Yeah.
I hear Job saying, I don't understand. I've done the right thing. I don't understand. He doesn't say, this is wrong to God. I think I agree that there is some accountability.
No.
And I would go farther than saying that it is what is accepted as the reward. We find out there may still be reward, but not the reward that we anticipate.
So I'm back to what is this book about?
Well, at the end, God does reveal to Job that the ignorance of mankind, and they have no idea about the divine role in all that was happening. And that was the mistake. It was just like Cain and Abel. Cain, when killed Abel, he didn't know why. He was offering. Why wasn't his offering as good as?
I'm not buying that. Come on, don't give me that stuff about God's ways are mysterious and you got to be patient with your suffering.
To Job, he revealed his workings about.
Hey, look, guys. Let me try this a different way. All right. I live in Winnetka. I don't know Chicago as well as I ought to, but I'm assuming that's a leafy kind of suburb, and I'm well-to-do, all right? And the earthquake hits, all right? and the earthquake hits, and my family is destroyed, and my home is destroyed, and blah, 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 blah. You know, a modern Job, all right? Things are going very badly for me, and you now come over to my house. What do you got to say to me? When I say to you, why? What have I done? I'm a good guy, you know? I pay my taxes. I'm a good middle-class guy. I've never broken a law in my life. Never been caught breaking a law in my life. You know, I'm a good guy. I don't deserve this. What are you going to say to me? God works in mysterious ways? Thanks a lot, you know? Thanks a lot. Boy, come comfort me again sometime, you know?
It has nothing to do with your character is what I would tell you. And if I were to use Job as an example of that, I would just point out that Job had a great deal of mental and emotional and spiritual fortitude at a time when his life was in ruin. And he just hung on to what he did have, which was hope in God.
Yeah, yeah.
And even though he did not feel that what was happening was just, somehow that faith gave him hope.
Well, you guys are very good. I mean, you really do have a good hold to this book. I agree with you completely. I think what this book is about, if I ask myself the same question, I really don't think it's about the question of theodicy, the question of innocent suffering. That is never answered in the Bible. It is simply never answered. It simply is. It happens, you know? And then we got to deal with it. And we got to do something about it. And what I think this work really is about, as you guys have repeatedly hit, it's about faith. It's about maintaining a faith in the face of an orthodoxy that could crush you. You will not buy into the orthodoxy. It's very difficult to do. Very difficult to do.
He does it, in my opinion, because he has a personal relationship with God.
Good for you.
He's not going through a secondary individual
That's
or
correct.
following a somebody told him to. It's
right.
a contract between the two.
It's a living personal faith. I agree with you.
Exactly.
I want to go to the tape, because I asked these questions of Rabbi Kushner, who wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And we'll get a chance to see what Rabbi Kushner had to say about both what the book is about, the question of theodicy, and his spin on the book of Job.
I'm sitting here with Rabbi Harold Kushner, the author of When Bad Things Happen to Good People, a bestseller of about 10 years ago and still an enduring classic. And we're talking about the book of Job. Rabbi Kushner, thank you for joining me to talk about the book of Job. The book of Job is a very complex work with many different themes. Can you summarize the book of Job for us?
In very brief context, there are three ideas which everybody in the book would like to affirm. One, God is all-powerful. Nothing happens in the world unless God wants it to. Two, God is completely good. He makes sure that we get what we deserve. If we've been nice, he rewards us. If we've been naughty, he punishes us. Three, Job is a good person. Now, as long as Job is healthy, wealthy, and respected, you can affirm all three of those with no conflict. When Job begins to suffer, when he loses his business, when his kids are killed, when he gets sick, you can no longer affirm all three. What you can do, and it's fascinating, any combination will work, you can believe any two by denying the third. And the intellectual challenge in Job is, which of those three ideas are you prepared to sacrifice so you can affirm the other two? Job's friends, because they have to affirm what they were taught, God is all-powerful, God is all good, decide Job isn't a good man. If he were, why would a righteous God do this to him? Job's answer is to deny that God is good. God is so powerful that my righteousness doesn't make him do anything. You remember Job says at one point, would that there were an umpire between us. That is, I wish there were somebody, some force, powerful enough to make God play fair. But God is so totally powerful, he can ignore considerations of fairness. That's the religious answer with which Job begins. And that, I think, is what he has to outgrow by the end of the book.
From one point of view, the book of Job is not about theodicy at all, but it's about faith and about a man's wrestling with the presence of God and finally coming to some kind of communion with God.
That's right. Well, I don't know what to make of that remark at the very end about where God says to the friends, you have not spoken truth. And my servant Job has, because I don't know if that's part of the ancient fable or part of the more thoughtful philosophical writing. No, I think for me, my favorite passage in the whole book, and the one that means the most to me, is, I believe it's in chapter 13, where Job says, in essence, if God is really the God you guys are talking about, he respects my integrity more than he respects your flattery. This, I think, is one of the key issues of the book, not so much about the nature of God, but about the integrity of the individual facing unfairness in the world. Does a real human being grovel and debase himself, or does a real human being stand up to God and say, not by my standards, but by your standards, this is not something that should happen? For me, the great message of the book of Job is the legitimacy of protest. The idea that, like Abraham, it is right and proper, it is religiously valid to stand up to God and say, you're a God of fairness, this is not fair. That it is the less religious, the less authentic response to bow one's head and say, God's will be done, and the more authentic religious response to say, shall not the judge of all the earth do justly?
Yeah, so the orthodoxy then becomes the very nature, how do I phrase this? The very orthodox nature of the Friends' faith keeps them from a personal and meaningful relationship with the Creator.
I think so. The Book of Job is a very radical book. It's not a pious book. I don't know how it got into the canon. Some people, some scholars, and I don't know if they're being serious or facetious, ironic, some say the Book of Job was led into the scripture because of the Friends' arguments, their defense of piety. And Job is seen as the villain in the case. It's hard for me to believe that anybody could read this book and not be on Job's side, so I'm not sure that's the reason. I think the sages who defined the canon were just spiritually open enough to make room for Job, to make room for Ecclesiastes, to make room for the eroticism of Song of Songs. Had I been on the committee, I'm not sure which way I would have voted on those three books.
Do you see the Book of Job as ultimately pessimistic or optimistic?
Oh, definitely optimistic. Okay. That is the idea. The message is not, as some would like to believe, that if you live a good life, you will not suffer without cause, that people get what they deserve. That might be the super optimistic view. Alas, we don't live in that kind of a world. I had a professor who used to say, expecting the world to treat you fairly because you're an honest person is like expecting the bull not to charge you because you're a vegetarian. That is, once you realize this is an unfair world, the optimistic view is to say, I can survive it. I can find within myself, with God's help, the capacity to survive. The pessimistic view would be to say, doesn't make any difference, the world's going to beat you down. The fact that somebody cared enough to write this book, I think, is evidence that he was optimistic about it. Who writes a book saying there's no point to it? No, I think it's definitely optimistic.
You don't see this God as a kind of remote, austere, uncaring?
Not uncaring, but yes, kind of remote. I think the way the author of Job envisions God, he is awesomely powerful, very remote. It's a once in eternity concession to Job's innocent challenge that God deigns to speak to him. You and I couldn't pull that off. If you and I suffer and throw down the gauntlet to God and say, what are you doing? Come tell me about it. We don't have the credentials to force God to appear that this fictional character, Job, has. But this is the way the author makes his point. And I think it is, again, it is a radically anti-establishment, anti-pious, in the quotations of the conventional piety of the time, a very turning over the tables kind of book.
It is unlikely today that God will come down and talk to us from the whirlwind. How does one look for signs of the presence of God today?
My standard answer for people who ask for proof of God is not the ontological argument or the cosmological argument, any of that. My answer is that I'm always seeing ordinary people doing extraordinary things. That the proof of God is the ability of the human being to survive tragedy. That the presence of God, the promise of God, is not that he will weave a magic circle around us and keep us safe from what happens to other people, but that when inevitably tragedy touches us, God will give us the wherewithal to survive. That people will find within themselves qualities of soul, that they did not think they had, that they knew they didn't have until the day they needed it. Where does this come from if you didn't have it yesterday? Where do we get the ability to go on year after year coping with grief, with pain, with limitations, unless there really is a God who replenishes our strength when we've used it up? This, I think, is the real last line of the book of Job, that the answer to tragedy is not to explain it, but to survive it. And God's promise is not that the world makes sense. God's promise is that when the world is unfair, He will be there to hold our hand and give us the means to be brave enough to go on living in an unfair world.
Yeah, there's a striking line in the book of Job toward the end, just before his repentance, where he says, "Before I had heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee," suggesting very much what you're implying here, that it is not through any kind of verbal dexterity that one communicates either faith or the existence of God, but rather through some kind of personal, intense, almost physical.
It's not an intellectual conclusion.
Yeah.
Martin Buber once made a distinction between theology and religion. He said theology is talking about God, religion is experiencing God. And the difference between theology and religion, he said, is the difference between reading a menu and having dinner. The Friends are essentially reading a menu. The Friends are giving Job theology, when what he really needs from them is a hug and a pat on the back. And they keep giving him words. I'd heard of you by the hearing of the ear. What God gives Job is not a theological explanation, but a sense of His presence. The real answer to how people survive, I think, is in the incarnation of God in caring people. Had the Friends been less concerned with defending God's honor, had they realized that God probably would say to them, "Don't worry about me, I can take care of myself, you take care of my bleeding children on earth," they would have argued with Job less. I mean, one of the almost funny ironies of the book is these three people come to comfort Job and they end up calling him names. They end up hurling all sorts of accusations against him because they feel obliged to defend God's honor. And yet, Jeff, are we flattering God when we say He's responsible for every malignant tumor, for every heart attack, for every birth defect, for every earthquake? Do we really add to God's glory if we say He wanted the child to die, He wanted the plane to crash? The Friends paint themselves into this theological corner. It is so important for them to insist that what they learned in Sunday school was true. God is all-powerful, God is all good, that they end up saying, "Job, you must have done something to deserve this." And it just doesn't make sense. Had they been real friends, they would have understood what Job really needed from them was a silent presence and a hug, and not these long, wordy theological explanations.
Yeah, the modern equivalent probably is putting some kind of interpretive gloss on meaningless suffering, finding meaning in the random violence.
And the real problem with that, Jeff, is when you try to explain random suffering, you end up in one way or another saying to the suffering person, "Shut up and stop crying, there must be a good reason for this." And that's just so emotionally wrong that I would hate to think this is the way religion comes across. Again, I fall back on Buber's dichotomy. That may be theology, it's not religion.
Yeah.
That's a marvelous point, isn't it? He made several really good points, I thought, in that. Did you enjoy that? I'm curious. Did you? Yeah. What's your response to that?
You had asked what the book of Job was about earlier, and there was some things floating around in my mind, and then listening to him brought something else. Job himself said that only precious metal is tried in fire. And so he accepted the idea that he was suffering not because he was sinful or he had done anything wrong, but he was accepting the fact that God promised that, we each are special to him, and as such, he had been exposed to a fire per se, and that for that reason he was a precious being, and that God wasn't discounting him or turning his back.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It's an interesting point. It's so different, isn't it, from so much modern stuff. When I asked him a difficult question there, and in a few minutes we're also going to look at an interview I did over in England with a fellow called David Kleins at the University of Sheffield, who is one of the great Job scholars in the world. And I asked him the same question, whether he thought it was an optimistic or pessimistic work. Any of you want to try to tackle that? Optimistic or pessimistic? So let me put it in a context, and I'll ask the question again. I'm sorry to play this game with you, but he seems to be living in a wonderfully ordered universe. I envy Job's ordered universe in the sense that he can look up to the stars, make his rather bold assertions, and be confident that somebody is listening. I go to the beach at night, and I look up at the stars, and it goes on and on and on and on into infinity. And in the modern world, I'm not, what's it all about, Alfie? I stand on that beach, and I'm tiny in the universe. I'm like a little grain of that sand in the universe. Whereas Job is almost at the center of his universe. How comforting, how wonderfully comforting to know that somebody's listening. We both have the same dilemma. Job and I both have the same dilemma. We're innocent sufferers, but at least he has a sense that there's somebody in charge, and I don't. As a modern, I don't. Modern man, early man was on the staircase and could look down and see Adam and Eve down there at the bottom step, and could look up the staircase, and the top step was bathed in light, but at least there was a God there. Modern man's in the middle of the staircase, and he looks down into some kind of primordial swamp, not knowing where he or she came from, and looks up, and the staircase just keeps going up and up and up and up into infinity, and there's no light at the top. Optimistic or pessimistic, the book of Job?
I think it's an optimistic book. To me, the book of Job says that you can start with a happy, wonderful life. It can all fall apart, but with struggle and patience and a faith, you can come back with another happy life in some form or other, and have learned from this adversity and have a wonderful life again.
Yeah, that's one of the, let me be combative a little bit, that's one of the real cheap shots in this book of Job, because its conclusion runs counter to the thought of the middle. The whole poetic meditation is an argument against the doctrine of rewards and punishments, and so of course what happens at the end? He's rewarded. He gets double everything for being a good guy. You go, wait a minute, you just argued that the doctrine of rewards and punishments doesn't work, and then you turn around in the conclusion and reward the guy. It would have been much truer to life if Job just went on suffering right to the end.
Well, both happened. Really both happened.
Yeah.
And he lived long enough that was able to happen with him, but his faith and his resolution, his hanging in there, didn't depend on that. He wasn't looking for that. And I think the other thing that troubled me about it was, even in the ending, when he was having all his good things back, then it noticed that his relatives and his friends all came to his table again and all. Yeah. And I thought, well, where were they? Because earlier, when you asked what you would say to someone whose world is falling apart, it seems to me maybe the best thing you could say was, how can I help?
Yeah.
What can I do?
The comforters never do that, do they?
Yeah. That idea of something being wrong in you, and that's why you're suffering, is still strong.
Oh, absolutely true. Absolutely true. The weakness is in me, isn't it? Yeah. What have I done to deserve this? We always ask that question, don't we? Yeah.
Did we ever think that the mentality at the time may have been wrong? Well, it was wrong, where they thought that good was a result of rewards were because of the result of being good. And God says his ways are not your ways.
That's correct.
And his mind, mentality of man will never reach God's mentality. And he's showing Job when he says, do you know who started the world, and do you know why
he never answers Job's questions. Do we agree? He never answers the questions.
But the thing about
power,
which leads man to believe that the only way you can please God is through faith, and he says that through the Bible. So the thing to do is to have this faith, and that's why Job could commune with God. When he looked up and felt the nearness of God, he had a relationship. He had this faith.
Let me make it more complicated. Do you think the three friends didn't have faith?
They were wrong thinking. They had wrong.
Well, here we go again, you know?
That's the thing.
You know, well, they were the wrong stripe or what? You
But
know?
see, the story, the whole reason it's in the Bible, I think, is because it's just showing that you can mean well and still be wrong.
Well, the other thing is, for Job, he had an intimate relationship with God.
Yes.
God wasn't just in church or
That's
a
right.
ritual person.
Yes.
He could talk with God like that because he knew God like that.
Yeah. This book really argues against orthodoxy, doesn't it? It's quite remarkable that it's in the canon.
And yet he kept the laws, evidently. Those were his friends.
Yeah.
So you don't say orthodoxy doesn't matter. That's how he knew he was good. Because, you know, he had done everything he knew. And he pointed out that he had seen.
That's
I've
right.
seen evil men prosper.
That's correct.
I've seen that happen.
That's correct, Peter, as we all have.
I'm puzzled as to why in all of our discussions and in the rabbis' discussions, they never bring up the argument of Elihu.
Again, please?
Is it Elihu?
Oh, Elihu, yeah, the third, yeah.
But at any rate, you know, he seems to, you know, provide the answer with the mystery of God, and in effect would provide the answer, you know, if life had been normal, he would not have, Job would not have been rewarded at the end, and he would have continued to suffer, and that would, his explanation of it would be as to why he would continue to suffer.
Yeah, the speeches of Elihu are usually considered a much later edition. This is, here we go into what they call higher criticism again. And I don't want to get us into that swamp because none of us is prepared for this. But it's usually considered a later edition that it was added. He's very vehement. Remember the tone is, whoa, he is vehement in his accusations. And it's thought by most scholars that it was a later addition to kind of tone down as far as possible the heretical nature of what Job is saying. But your point is very well taken. And you know, you might want to know that in most anthologies, the Elihu speeches are ripped right out. Most people don't even get to read them unless you're reading from the Bible. Good point.
We have many questions when tragedy hits us.
We sure
why
do.
me?
Yeah,
why,
sure.
you know? And I don't know, one of the precepts was that we shouldn't eat from the tree of knowledge. Well, we wanted to know the answers, and we don't have answers. And I think that it's very difficult to hang on to a deep faith constantly and say, well, this is a random thing that has happened, and, you know, why not me?
Yeah.
It's very difficult, but you have the option. Do you go on, or do you remain in this state of abject misery? So you have gotten the ability to cope. And I see hope in capital letters always at the end of this.
Yeah, you're making a very good point. That Job's winning to his faith, and he really does go from Job's pain. I'm being incoherent here. Job's pain, well, we all agree, is really much more psychological than it is physical. Would you agree? The fear that maybe there's nobody up there listening. You know, maybe there isn't that kind of divinely ordered universe that he thinks ought to exist. And remember, we talked about alienation with Adam and Eve. Job's feeling a real alienation from his God. And he moves through, if we chart the movement through the book, he moves through a kind of despair, you know, that I'll quote from Dante. We'll look at the story of Paolo and Francesca in the Inferno, and there's this wonderful line that says, in effect, there is nothing worse than remembering former happiness in pain. It's a great line. I mean, it is a great line. And Job, remember that wonderful chapter where Job goes on recounting his former happiness, and he knows it's gone, you know, and he's just in the pits of despair, and he comes out of that despair into that before I had heard of thee, now mine eyes seeth thee, and he wins through to that faith. That really is a heroic journey, isn't it, for Job? He's very much a kind of epic hero, only the battlefield is not the physical battlefield, it's the battlefield of the soul, which I think most of you will agree is the much more difficult battlefield for the human being.
I don't think of Job as a heretical book. I think he is calling upon God to be just. I mean, he's the kind of God that we really want to be able to believe in. But
Rabbi Kushner's discussion, too, brings a different light on God. In the biblical times, God had his finger on all pulses, you know, and he was doing everything, and he talked to people directly, and he even shown his face to Job. But I think Rabbi Kushner is saying that to answer some of modern questions, we have to take some of the omnipotence away from God.
That's right. He does
cannot
argue
be,
that.
yeah,
Yep.
he's not all-knowing, all-doing, because we wouldn't be able to cope with the world that we're living in.
Good for you. That's exactly what he says.
Yeah.
And he says it in the book. He says that, as he said on the clip, he says we diminish God by making him responsible for every malignant tumor, I think was the expression he used, in it, something like that. And he does, he suggests in the When Bad Things Happen to Good People, which is, I recommend to you, it's a nice, easy read, and it's provocative and thoughtful. And he suggests to you that there are forces in the universe quite beyond anyone's control. They simply are, and one must go on. One must deal
And I
with
just
them.
want to interject that this is from a man whose son is terribly ill.
That is correct.
Yeah.
That was the impetus for writing the book.
Right.
I'm not going to plug his book anymore. Is Job you? Is Job you?
Absolutely.
Yes?
Absolutely.
Why?
I think it's a great victory for the whole human spirit. It tells us that no matter what happens to it, we have the power to survive it.
The indomitable will to survive.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think that the power of God, we can go back to Genesis, that God is within us. We were made in the image and likeness of God. And so it becomes a matter of tapping into the power.
Yeah. So you see a
get
very
past the limitations.
Yes. Yeah. So you see a very positive, very optimistic view of man. Yeah.
And you see another use of the privilege of choice, because that's what made the conversation between Satan and God interesting.
Yeah, explain.
Job had a choice. Sometimes in great tragedy, a person either finds themselves growing closer to God, or the exact opposite can happen.
Sure.
Where you find yourself going farther away.
So you guys are not bothered by the fact that this universe seems so incoherent? You're not bothered by the fact that only the good die young, to quote a Billy Joel song? You're not bothered by all this innocent suffering, you know?
You're bothered.
And you still posit justice? I don't get you guys. You're Pollyannas.
I think Job was rewarded. I think he was pacified. I think that the things that meant the most to Job remained unseen. His family, gone. I mean, the greatest support system that we have, in my opinion, on earth is one another. It comes from sharing hope and faith and the perceptions and concept of God and a higher power. And, you know, Job's family.
But they were restored to him in the end.
out.
Yeah, but they were restored to him in the end.
Not the same things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. But again, you guys are not troubled by, I just don't get you guys. You're all so Pollyanna-ish, you know? I mean, it seems to me that life is futile, life is painful, life is misery, and it doesn't add up to anything. It's just a...
fair. It isn't fair.
It's not fair, but it doesn't mean it isn't good.
But I go with the friends.
You guys drive me crazy. Listen, we're gonna listen to. I want to go to a interview I did with David Kleins at the University of Sheffield in England. David Kleins has written a multi-volume commentary on the Book of Job, which is one of the definitive ones, and there he is.
Job was originally a work about piety, about the right way to be, about religious faith, if you like. And I think increasingly I've seen it as an affirmation of the human spirit in the face of orthodoxies of all kinds. And I think the great thing about Job is that he resists not only God, but especially theologians who profess to speak for God. And he out-theologizes them all because he actually speaks of what he knows and not of what he speculates about. And if he's wrong, but at least he's speaking from his own experience. And so that's part of my enthusiasm from the book, that I suppose I identify with this Job who speaks from experience against orthodoxy. But the other thing that I find very intriguing and tantalizing about the book is this question of closure, of wrapping things up, of tying things together, which is such an important drive in modern life. Maybe it was in everybody's life, as if it was a necessity for security. And I think in our postmodern culture and climate these days, we've come to see that that is not the way the world is. Whether we've come to live with it comfortably is another question. But I think Job, the book of Job especially, not Job the person, the character, the book of Job, I think qualifies as one of the earliest postmodern works.
Yeah, it's interesting for me to wonder how the book of Job was canonized, how a work that so attacks orthodoxy could have become such a permanent part of the Old Testament.
Well, I think I have a fairly shallow view of the process of canonizing the Old Testament. I think some people think that this was a highly intellectual and probably very religious activity in which holy people evaluated books for their spiritual worth. I really rather doubt that. I wouldn't be surprised if the canon of the Hebrew Bible was more or less all the old books that we have, and that books were in the canon because they existed. Now, that doesn't quite answer the question, how did the book of Job survive? Because whenever it was written, there must have been some centuries between its being written and its being part of a collection that had some kind of authoritative status. So the question becomes not how does such a deviant book get accepted by an Orthodox community, so much as who was it in the community in general was wanting to read this book, copy it, talk about it, reflect on it, so that there was a public demand for it. So I'd like to think about the reading public that actually was the original addressees of the book, but also were the people who preserved it, because a book doesn't last even 100 years without a reading public. In our day it goes out of print. Well, I think in ancient times there was some sort of equivalent to a book being available or unavailable, and there must always have been a public.
And further evidence, perhaps, and perhaps obviously, that it speaks so closely to the human experience that the public would respond as positively and warmly to the book of Job.
Yes. Yeah. Just what is the human experience it's responding to is an interesting question, because something I can never get out of my mind is the fact that Job is laboring under a huge misapprehension, because he thinks he is being punished by God for something. But the book starts by telling you, no, he's not being punished for anything. This is an experiment God is doing to see whether it's possible for a human being to suffer dreadfully and still retain their belief in God. And so Job has got completely the wrong end of the stick, and he never gets to know why it was he was suffering. We, the readers, know. He never knows. We sympathize with Job, but actually he's in the dark the whole time. Why should we sympathize with somebody instead of saying, oh, well, he was completely wrong? The friends are all wrong too. The book makes it very patent that you shouldn't believe the views of any of the friends there. So when you add it all together, who's in the right? Where does the book say a single thing that it actually supports?
That's a marvelous point. Yes. Yeah, the dramatic irony that's established in the opening chapter of the book, that this is just really a kind of wager with the Satan, is never revealed, of course, to Job.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the whole book is a wager with the audience, actually. I don't want to say it's a game, because it's serious. Maybe it's a serious game, because it's testing your reflexes, it's trying ideas on with you. It is the first seminar in history, really, isn't it? Where different people are putting in their contribution, and there is no authoritative voice at the end who says, well, I'll tell you the way it really is. Not even the God character actually finalizes or wraps up the conversation, and that's an amazing thing also in a book of this character.
Yeah. I've had students ask me whether they think the book of Job is optimistic or pessimistic. You want to try to tackle that one?
Optimistic or pessimistic? I think it's a wonderful question, because you could go either way, couldn't you?
Yeah.
You could say, no matter what misfortunes befall human beings, there is something indomitable about the human spirit that perseveres. Or you could say, no matter what comforts religion profess to offer to you, the fact is the world is a chaos and there is no meaning.
So you've answered it on both sides. Yes, you haven't answered it either.
Convincingly, I hope.
That's marvelous. Isn't that wonderful? He has a real playfulness of mind that comes through there. Very nimble mind. Yeah, you're optimistic or pessimistic. I can't stop coming back to that question. How do you think it would be if Job really found out why he suffered? Mr. Kleins makes a wonderful point there, doesn't he? Job never knows why he suffers. Suppose he were to discover the truth. Well, you see, Job, I had this bet with the Satan, and you were the pawn. You were the little plaything. And hey, I'm sorry, but I work in mysterious ways. And I don't need to explain to you how I work, and you lose because I've got the power.
But I don't know if the optimism, pessimism is really what Job is doing, which is continually fighting, and he would still not give up, and he would still fight, and he'd be feisty about that bone of contention also.
Yeah, he'd take God on, wouldn't he? Yeah, how dare you? It's not supposed to be this way, you know? Yeah. Isn't that part of it? This is almost a tragedy. And I like to make a distinction between tragedy and comedy. There are some who have argued, by the way, that this really is a tragedy. There are scholars who argue that this really is a kind of early tragedy structured along the lines of a Greek tragedy. I don't buy it for a minute. It's a wonderfully provocative argument. There's not enough development. It's just too much speaking. But anyway, let me make a point. The tragic hero, it seems to me, always has a kind of adolescent view of the universe. The tragic hero is always bitterly disappointed that the world isn't the way it ought to be. You guys, most of you guys are old enough, you probably have children, you've had adolescent children. Boy, they're a pain, aren't they? I have an 18-year-old at home that is on the verge of death on almost a daily basis. He bemoans the fact constantly that the world does not conform to the way it ought to be. He's an idealist. He's a wonderful, wonderful idealist. Comedy, on the other hand, is a much more adult view of the world. Comedy sees the world as it really is and just finds it wonderfully funny. It doesn't, for a minute, begin to say the world ought to be a certain way. It accepts the world on its own terms and finds it quite absurd. Job, an idealist or a realist? I did not promise you easy questions here, okay? Yeah.
We should think about why the authors of Job use Job as a vehicle to teach the Jews. You know, they are the chosen people, yet even chosen people suffering. So I think there has to be an ending of optimism, because the Jews, you know, throughout the Bible suffer, and God sometimes rewards.
This is true to the world as we know it, isn't it? Job is really true to life as we know it. Yes? We suffer. Come on. That's what it means to be a human being, is to suffer. The question becomes, how did you endure it?
This is, if you think of him in terms of, this is sort of a prelude to the Divine Comedy, the Dante-esque approach. He's kind of like, you think of him in terms of Jerry Seinfeld. Literally, you know, responding to a never-ending battle.
Yeah.
I would think more of a comedy in the Dante sense than a tragedy.
Yes, yeah, I agree. That's the point I was trying to make, quite frankly. Yeah.
But don't you think that perhaps Job knows the mean? He knows what he's striving for, what it should be. He has this relationship with God, whom he knows is very good. He knows what the world should be. And the person that just sort of laughs about it, well, he's already thrown in the towel and he's hopeless. He has nothing to stand on. Job has a firm foundation to stand on.
Yeah, he has his integrity. He stands on his integrity.
And I think there's that question you asked him, he said, what would he have done if he had known the situation? I think he'd say, okay, come on, throw your worst at me, I'll take it. Yes, he is that type of person. I think he would have, that's what that faith is. He had that faith to be able to do that.
I was just going to say, speaking as a mother, the worst happened when they took his family. I mean, who cares about the cattle and all the rest? But the family, to use them as pawns to prove a point to someone else, I mean, that's enough to make anybody lay down and cry.
Yeah, he had it very bad indeed. Yeah. Isn't it easy to see how empty orthodoxy is?
Because orthodoxy...
Try it in your own life, guys. Stretch for the orthodoxy in your own life.
But orthodoxy is man-made rules.
That's right.
And Job was dealing with God, divinity. Right. And man-made rules, well, you know the limitations of man's mind, as great as he may think he is, it's not the mind of Christ.
What I would hope you would do coming out of the book of Job is confront your own orthodoxies. The orthodoxies you live your life by. The ones you don't think to question. Maybe the ones you don't even know to question. There are a gazillion of them. And it is very difficult to confront them. Very difficult. It is easy to confront them vicariously through a work like the book of Job. One can see that the friends' orthodoxy kept them from being friends. That the comforters were no comforters. Their orthodoxy blocked any kind of human connection. And yet, we are filled with all sorts of orthodoxies that we live our lives by. And it is very, very difficult, I think, to lead any kind of authentic life if your life is wrapped up in orthodoxies, usually not orthodoxies of your own making. What I think is most provocative about the book of Job is that it ultimately forces you to question received and inherited opinion. What the book of Job forces upon us is to question tradition, because isn't that what the three friends are mouthing through the book? Tradition. They know how God acts because tradition tells them how God acts. It is extremely, extremely difficult for us, A, to recognize the orthodoxies in our own life, B, to question the orthodoxies in our own life, and then C, to win through to some kind of authenticity after confronting those orthodoxies. That's what Job has the courage and the strength to do.
But didn't orthodoxy shape Job? Perhaps it did make him this strong man.
It shapes everyone, but he maintains the authentic integrity in the face of it. Yes, he is not willing to give in to the easy answers of those orthodoxies. I really feel like I'm on a soapbox here, but this is something we're going to come back to again and again and again, the need for authenticity. Thanks very much for your attention. We're out of the book of Job.